The cold came up through the floorboards of the schoolroom at Ashcombe House, and Honoria Vale stood very still in the grey morning light with a letter in her hands that had been sealed in black wax. The slates of the 3 Ashcombe children were still warm where they had pressed their palms while copying their sums, and the chalk dust hung in the thin shaft of sun that came over the moor of the lawn. Behind her, in the doorway, Mr. Pottle the butler waited with his hands folded, and he cleared his throat in the soft way a man does when he is unwilling to be the cause of grief, but must, all the same, be practical. "Shall I send for the trap, Miss Vale?" he said. "If you're to catch the up coach at the Crossways, it goes at 11:30, and the road's heavy after the rain." Honoria did not answer him at once. She held the letter level, the way she held a needle or a pen or a child's chin when she wished to look into its face, and she read it through again, though she had read it already and knew now what it said. The seal had cracked clean across when she lifted it, and under her thumb the broken wax was the color of dried blood. The hand within was a stranger's, careful and old, the letters formed with the deliberateness of a man whose eyes were failing him, and who would not let them fail him into error. It was from a Mr. Alderley, solicitor, of Stonegate in the city of York, and it began with the gravity such men keep for the conveying of death. Her godfather was dead. The Reverend Josiah Quill, clerk in Holy Orders, of the village of Marsden under Edge in the North Riding of Yorkshire, had departed this life on the 14th day of the month, in his 71st year, full of years and, the solicitor permitted himself to add, of good works. And he had named her Honoria Vale in his last will and testament. She had not seen Josiah Quill since she was 9 years old. The knowledge of it came to her plainly, without drama, the way all true things came to her. 18 years. She had been 9, and it had been at her own father's funeral, in the small damp churchyard at Pinmore in Dorset, and a great tall clergyman, with a north country voice, had taken her cold hand in both of his enormous warm ones and held it as though it were a bird he had found and meant to keep from harm. She remembered the warmth of those hands more than she remembered his face. He had given her, before he went away again to his moors, a prayer book bound in brown leather with brass at the corners and a brass clasp that shut with a small sweet click, and he had told her she remembered the words, for she had kept words carefully even then, that a girl who could already read her psalter so steady would never want for a friend in heaven nor, he hoped, for one on earth. Then he had gone north, and the years had folded over him, and she had grown up and been put out to earn her bread, and he had become a name she prayed for and a hand she remembered. Nothing more. And now he was dead, and he had remembered her. She became aware that Mr. Pottle was still waiting, and that her stillness was becoming a thing that troubled him. So she did what she always did. She folded the letter along its old creases, exact corner to exact corner, and she slid it into the pocket of her gray morning gown, and she turned to him with her composure whole. "Thank you, Miss Pottle," she said. "Not the trap quite yet. I have the children's sums to mark, and Master Edward has not finished his 9 times, and I will not leave a thing half done. If you would be so good as to tell Mrs. Pottle I shall want my trunk down by 10, and ask whether the up coach takes an outside seat as far as the Great North Road, I should be obliged." "An outside seat, miss?" said Pottle, and something moved in his elderly face, for an outside seat in October was a cold and public way for a gentlewoman to travel, and they both knew what it meant about the state of her purse. "I'll ask. I'm sorry, miss, for your loss." "Thank you," she said again, and meant it, and that was all. She did not weep. She had learned a long time ago that weeping was a luxury, like wax candles and a second shawl, that a woman in her position spent only in private and never before breakfast. She sat down again at the long deal table among the warm slates, and she drew Master Edwards toward her, and she marked his 9 times where he had gone astray at 9 sevens, and she wrote in her small clear hand, "Look again, and you will find it," which was what she always wrote, and which she had come to believe was as near a creed as she possessed. Only when the sums were marked, and the slates set in their rack, and the schoolroom put to rights as she would have it found, did she allow herself to sit by the cold grate and think. She was 27 years old. She was the daughter of a Dorset parson who had died poor, and a mother who had died poorer still, and earlier, and she had neither living kin that she knew of, nor any portion in the world but what she earned. For 6 years she had been governess to the children of Mr. and Mrs. Ashcombe of Devon, and she had taught them their letters and their figures and their manners, and she had been, she believed, a good servant to them, for a governess was a servant, however the word was softened, and she had never let herself forget it, because forgetting it was how such women came to grief. The Ashcombes were not unkind. They were merely cool, as some good fires are cool, giving light without much warmth. And they had paid her wage on the quarter day and never raised it, and never asked her to sit with them of an evening, and she had not expected them to. She had her own small room under the eaves with a good window, and the children loved her in the unthinking way of children, and she had saved, against the day of need that always comes, £6 and some odd shillings tied in a stocking in the bottom of her trunk. That was her whole estate in the world this morning. £6, a stocking, a trunk, and a brass-bound prayer book. And now it seemed a great deal more, though what exactly she did not yet understand. She drew the letter out again, and read past the death and the condolence to the particulars, which Mr. Alderley had set down with the dry exactness of his trade. The Reverend Josiah Quill had bequeathed to his goddaughter Honoria Vale, spinster, of the parish of Ashcombe in the county of Devon, the property known as Greystone, being the foundling house standing above the village of Marsden under Edge, together with its lands, its goods, its furnishings, and all that pertained to it whatsoever. A foundling house, an orphanage, in the plain word. He had left her a house full of orphans, she who was herself an orphan, and the thought of it sat in her chest strangely, half weight and half warmth, and she set it aside to be felt properly later, as she set most things aside. But there was more, and it was the more that made her read the passage 3 times over. Item, wrote Mr. Alderley, there pertains to the said bequest a matter held in trust since the year 1792, of which the nature and particulars I am instructed and bound to communicate to you only in person, in which I beg you will not press me to set down in any letter that may be opened by other eyes than yours. A matter held in trust since 1792, of which he might speak only in person, of which he feared the opening of his letter by other eyes. Honoria's gray eyes went quiet and level over the words. She was not a fanciful woman, but she was a careful one, and care and fancy are sometimes nearer than they look. Something in that careful old solicitor's caution told her that the bequest was not so simple as a ruined house and a parcel of children, and that she was being summoned north not merely to grieve but to do. There was a second paper folded within the first, and this one was not in the solicitor's careful hand at all. It was in another hand entirely, large once and now gone shaky, the hand of a very old man writing perhaps with a failing arm, the letters wandering a little off the line, and the ink pressed hard where the pen had been gripped too tight. She knew, before she read a word of it, whose hand it was, because the brass-bound prayer book in her trunk had an inscription on its flyleaf in that same hand, grown only older. It was Josiah's own. "My dear child," it began, and at my dear child, from a man she had met once across 18 years, something tightened in her throat that she governed and went on. "If you read this, then I am gone on before, and Alderley has done as I bid him and found you. I have watched you from afar these many years, more than you knew, by letters to those who knew you. For a man may keep a candle in his window for a child he loved, and never trouble her with the light. I am told you are grown a good and steady woman, with your father's exactness in you and your mother's mercy, and that is the very pair of hands I have prayed God to send to Greystone, for it has sore need of both. It needs a steady hand and an honest eye, and I could think of none in all the world I would trust it to sooner than yours." She paused there, and pressed the back of her wrist once against her mouth, and then went on, because the letter was not finished, and because the last lines of it were not warm but strange, and the strangeness woke her up like cold water. "One thing more, and mark it well, for I dare not write it plainer in a letter that hands not yours may chance to open. What was set down in 92 is not lost, whatever Crispin may say to you, and he will say much. Do not believe him. Look to the book that is not where books are kept. There you will find the whole of it, and the children's bread is safe, and no man can take from them what was given. God keep you, my dear, and forgive an old man who loved you at a distance and asks of you. Now he is dead, a harder thing than he ever dared ask living. Your affectionate godfather, Josiah Quill." Honoria sat for a long while with that in her lap, and the cold grate before her, and the morning getting on toward 10. "Look to the book that is not where books are kept." She turned the words over. They were not the wandering of a sick old mind. She would not let herself think them so, because the hand, for all its shake, had pressed the words down with great deliberateness, and a man does not press hard on words he does not mean. The book that is not where books are kept. A book, then, hidden somewhere a book would not be looked for. And Crispin? Who was Crispin? She did not know the name. A relation, plainly, by the easy way the letter used it, expecting her to know or soon to learn. Whatever Crispin may say to you, and he will say much, do not believe him. So there was an adversary already named in the will of a dead man, waiting for her in the north like weather. She found she was not frightened by it. She was, if anything, steadied by it, the way a clear statement of a difficult sum steadied her. Here is the problem. Set down plain, now we find the answer. She did not understand the letter. She did not pretend to herself that she understood it, but she did the thing she always did with what she did not understand and meant to understand later. She took out her pocket memorandum book, the small worn one with the pencil tied to it by a thread, and she copied the strange lines into it exactly, every word, the way she had copied her father's sermons and her household accounts and the children's progress. Look to the book that is not where books are kept, in her small, clear, upright hand, so that whatever became of the letter, the words were now hers and could not be lost. Then she closed the book and tied the thread and put it away. The rest of the morning she spent in the proper ordering of a departure, for she would no more leave a place in disorder than she would leave a sum half-marked. She went down to Mrs. Ashcombe in the morning room and told her, plainly and without display, that she had been left a small property in Yorkshire by her late godfather, and must go north directly to see to it, and that she gave, as was right, her notice. Mrs. Ashcombe, a handsome, cool woman with her embroidery in her lap, expressed a measured surprise and a measured regret, and said, after a pause that was a fraction too long, that of course if Miss Vale's circumstances should not answer in the north, there would, she supposed, be a place kept for her at Ashcombe a little while, the children being so used to her. It was not unkindly said, but it was said as one might offer an umbrella one rather hoped would be refused. And Aurea, who had heard the true note under many a polite one, heard it now. "You are very good, ma'am," she said, with no edge in it at all, for she kept no edges where they did no work. "But I think I shall not need to trouble you. There are children in the north who have lately lost the only friend they had, and I find I am wanted there. I will stay, of course, until you are suited with someone else. If a fortnight, a week will do, I'm sure," said Mrs. Ashcombe, a little too readily, and so it was settled, and Honoria understood, without bitterness, exactly how much she had been worth in that house, which was a fair wage promptly paid, and not one thing more. The children were harder. She had them up to the schoolroom one last time that afternoon, and she did not make a great matter of it, for she did not believe in wringing grief out of small hearts. But she sat with each of them and heard their reading, and told Master Edward that she expected him to have his 9 times perfect by Christmas, and that she would somehow know if he had not, and gave little Miss Cassandra the worn pencil from her memorandum book to keep, not the book, only the pencil, but it was a treasure between them, and the child knew it. They wept, which was their right and their nature, and she did not, which was hers. But she held them, all 3 at once in a great ungainly bundle, and over their heads her gray eyes were bright with what she would not spend, and that was as near as she came. She left Ashcombe House on the morning of the 7th day after, in a cold, clear dawn, with her trunk corded and her £6 in the stocking, and the brass-bound prayer book in her lap. Mr. Pottle had got her the outside seat as far as the Great North Road, where she should change for the York coach, and he handed her up to it himself, and tucked the worn rug about her knees with a care that surprised her, and said low, that it had been an honor to wait on a lady, and that there were them in that house as didn't know their luck when they had it, which was as much rebellion as Mr. Pottle had in him, and more than she had ever looked for. She thanked him, and did not trust herself to say more. Then the horn blew, and the coachman gathered his reins, and the coach swung out of the Ashcombe Lane and onto the high road north, and the green, soft hills of Devon began, slowly and then more quickly, to fall away behind her. She rode composed, as she did everything. The wind off the moors came keener as the day climbed and the country changed, the red Devon earth giving over by degrees to harder, paler stone, the hedges thinning, the sky widening and going gray at the edges with the promise of the north. She drew the prayer book from under the rug and held it in both her gloved hands, feeling the brass corners through the leather of her gloves. The brass clasp cold and familiar under her thumb, and she thought of a great warm pair of hands closing over a child's cold one in a Dorset churchyard, 18 years gone, and of the same hand, gone old and shaking, pressing strange words hard into the paper now folded in her breast. Look to the book that is not where books are kept. She did not know yet what it meant. She did not know what Greystone would be when she saw it rise gray out of its moor, nor who Crispin was, nor what had been set down in the year 1792 that a careful old solicitor would not trust to a letter, nor what duty exactly was waiting for her at the cold end of this cold road. But she was not afraid of not knowing. Not knowing was only a sum unworked. She had £6, a brass-bound prayer book, a memorandum with the dead man's words copied true, and her father's exactness and her mother's mercy, which a man who loved her had prayed God to send where they were needed. It was enough to be going on with. The coach climbed steadily north into the paling afternoon, and Honoria Vale folded her hands over the prayer book and went, unhurried and unweeping, toward a place she had never seen and a charge she had never asked for and a fight she did not yet know was waiting, toward the city of York and a careful old man in a book-lined room who had been bidden to tell her, only in person, what had been held in trust since 1792. Mr. Alderley's office sat above a stationer's shop in a narrow York street, and it smelled of dust, sealing wax, and the particular dryness of old paper that has been read many times and laid away. Honoria Vale was shown up a crooked stair by a clerk no older than 15, and when the door opened the solicitor rose from behind a desk so heaped with bundled documents that he seemed half buried in the business of the dead. He was a small man, narrow at the shoulder, with a great deal of white hair brushed forward over his ears, and he held a brass ear trumpet in one hand the way another man might hold a stick, not ashamed of it, simply requiring it. "Miss Vale," he said, and peered at her, and something in his face softened. Yes, you have his look about the eyes, though you'll not thank me for saying so, for he was no beauty. Sit, you'll take tea. Walter, tea, and the good chairs. He waved the trumpet at the clerk, who fled. She sat. She had come straight from the coaching inn, with her trunk left in the yard and the brass-bound prayer book in her reticule, and she was tired in the bones from 2 days on an outside seat. But she sat as she always sat, straight and quiet, her gloved hands folded, and she let the old man look at her as long as he liked. She had learned in 9 years of governessing that people told you more when you did not hurry them. "I was very sorry to read of my godfather's death," she said, pitching her voice clear and a little louder than ordinary toward the trumpet. "Your letter was kindly written, Mr. Alderley. I thank you for it." "Eh? Speak up. No. You do well enough. You've a carrying voice. That's sense in you. Most ladies whisper at me and then are vexed I can't hear." He lowered himself back into his chair. "Sorry. Yes. We were all sorry." Josiah Quill was the honestest man in the North Riding and the most awkward, and I had his business 40 years, and there's not a day I drew breath in his company I wasn't the better for it. He laid the trumpet on the desk and folded his spotted hands. "Now you'll want it plain, and I'll give it you plain, for I can see you're not the fainting sort, and thank God for it, because there is no time in this business for fainting. I should be grateful for plainness," Honoria said. So he gave it her. He spoke slowly, and now and again lifted the trumpet to catch her questions, and the tea came and cooled untouched between them while the short autumn afternoon went gray in the window. Greystone, he told her, was a foundling house, an orphanage, though the country folks still used the older word, that stood on the moor edge above the village of Marsden under Edge, some hours' drive north and west of York into the high country. Her godfather had founded it near 40 years gone and had run it ever since, sheltering the abandoned and the parentless children of half the dale, the byblows left at the church door, the orphans of a bad winter's fever, the small, unwanted human creatures that a hard country throws up and does not know what to do with. At present, Alderley said, there were 31 children under its roof, in the charge of a matron, a Mrs. Tibbet, a woman he plainly held in respect. "And the house?" Honoria asked. He pulled a face. "The house is half a ruin, I'll not lie to you. A wing fell, 3 winters past, the roof of it went, and they shut it up under tarpaulin and never mended it, for there was no money to mend it with. The slates on the main range are cracked, and the dormitory leaks and the gardens gone to frost. But," he held up one finger, and his voice took on a sudden firmness, "the walls are sound, and the foundations are sound. Tom Sefton the mason will tell you so, and he's an honest man. It is not a house falling down, Miss Vale. It is a house that has wanted spending on, and been starved of it. There is a difference, and the difference is the whole of your business. Starved of it, she repeated. My godfather had no means? Now there, said Alderley, is where it grows interesting, and where I must be careful, for I am about to tell you a thing I half understand and cannot wholly prove. He leaned back. The chair creaked. Josiah Quill was a clergyman of modest stipend who never married and spent every shilling he owned on those children for 40 years. That much I know to the penny, for I kept his books. But a man cannot feed and clothe 31 children year upon year and mend a great stone house on a country parson's living. He could not, and he did not. There was something older. Older, Honoria said. In the year 92, said the old solicitor, and he said it the way a man says a date he has worn smooth with handling. 1792. Before ever your godfather came to Marsden, a sum of money was settled in trust. Settled, that is, given over and locked up by deed, the income of it to be paid out yearly forever to maintain a foundling house upon that moor. In perpetuity the word is, a charity that cannot die, because its money is not spent but only its yearly fruit. Do you follow me? I follow you perfectly, she said. An endowment. An endowment. Just so. He looked pleased, as a man does when he need not say a thing twice. And the trusteeship of it, the keeping of the chest, you might say, the duty of paying the income out faithful and seeing it goes where it ought, that was vested by the deed in a great family of those parts. The Marsh line, whose head in our own day is the Duke of Harrogate, at Harrogate Hall some miles off. It is his grandfather's name, I believe, that stands among the witnesses to the original deed. The endowment is, in the law's eye, the Harrogate Trust, and has been near 100 years. He paused, and his old face clouded, and Honoria felt the chill in the room change quality, for she had begun to see the shape of the trouble before he named it. And here, said Alderley, is the knot. In recent years, 3 years, 4, that yearly income has not come to Greystone. It has stopped. Vanished out of the accounts I am able to see, as if a tap were turned off. Now Josiah swore to me on his own deathbed, Miss Vale, that the endowment was whole, that the principal was safe and lodged proper, that not a farthing of the trust capital was lost. It is safe, Alderley, he said. It is set down safe, only they shall not find where, for I have hid the book. Those were near his words. But, and here is the cruelty of it, I cannot lay my hand upon the deed, nor upon any ledger or writing that proves the endowment exists at all. Without that proof, he spread his dry hands, Greystone is, in the eye of the law, nothing but a tumble-down house upon the moor, with 31 mouths to feed and no income on earth to feed them. And a thing with no income and great value in its land is a thing, Miss Vale, that men will fight over. Honoria sat very still. The clock on the chimney-piece ticked. She thought of a line copied in a steady hand into a small memorandum book, and she did not say it aloud, but she felt it settle into place against everything the old man had told her, like a key felt for in the dark and found to fit. What was set down in 92 is not lost, whatever Crispin may say. Look to the book that is not where books are kept. She did not yet know what it meant, but she understood now that it meant everything, and she folded her hands the tighter and asked, in her level way, "Who is Crispin?" It was at that precise moment, as though the name had been a summons, that there came a brisk double knock at the office door, and it opened without waiting on an answer. and a gentleman came in bringing the cold of the stair and a great deal of warmth of manner with him. He was perhaps 34, well made, very well dressed, too well dressed, Honoria thought, for a morning call in a country town, a coat of dark blue superfine, a deal of fob and seal ribbon at his waist, gloves of a butter yellow that had never seen honest weather. He had a smooth, handsome, slightly fleshy face and brown hair brushed into careful disorder, and he smiled before he had so much as seen who was in the room, which Honoria noted, for a man who smiles before he knows whom he is smiling at is a man who has decided in advance to be liked. "Alderley, my dear fellow," he said, "forgive me. I'd no notion you were engaged. But then I never can get a clerk to announce me properly in this town." And then his eyes lit upon Honoria, and he stopped. And the smile changed, deepened, grew tender, and he laid one yellow-gloved hand upon his breast. "But I am a brute. I intrude upon, surely I have the honor of addressing my cousin, Miss Vale, of Devon." "This," said Alderley dryly, lifting his trumpet, "is Mr. Crispin Quill, the late Reverend's nephew." "Cousin Honoria," said Crispin Quill, and crossed the room and took her hand before she had decided to get, and pressed it between both of his, and looked down at her with eyes that were brown and soft and busy. "May I call you so? For we are kin, you and I, though distant. Your dear godfather was my own uncle, and in our common grief I think we need not stand on ceremony. I am so very glad to find you here. I have thought of you since the sad news. A lady alone brought all this weary way north on a strange old man's whim. It troubled me extremely." "You are very good," Honoria said, and gently, but quite definitely, withdrew her hand. "I am not greatly wearied, and my godfather was kind to me when I was a child, sir, so I do not think of his whim as strange." Something flickered behind the soft brown eyes. She saw it, the flick of a man finding the ground less soft underfoot than he had reckoned, but the smile held. No, of course. Loyalty, I honor it." He drew up a chair without being asked and sat, arranging his coat skirts, and turned to the solicitor with an air of getting briskly and regretfully down to sad necessities. "Alderley, since we are all three together, and I had meant to spare my cousin this, truly I had, perhaps it is kindest to be open. There is no joy in delay. You have the will. You will have told her what's in it." He spread his hands, rueful, generous, "and I'm sure it is a great kindness of my poor uncle's, and like him, to think of his goddaughter. But the difficulty, dear Miss Vale, is this, and I would not for the world have you put to expense and disappointment by it. The difficulty is that the will speaks of property my uncle was not, at the last, free to give." "Indeed," said Honoria. Indeed, he reached into his breast and drew out a folded paper, thick, with a seal upon it, and held it, did not give it, only held it, where the candlelight might catch the wax. "I have here, you see, an earlier instrument. A deed of gift, drawn and signed and sealed by my uncle's own hand, and witnessed conveying to me his nearest blood, his brother's son Greystone, and its lands and its goods, and all endowments thereunto belonging. It bears a date, Miss Vale, well before the date of the will that brought you north, and the law, as Alderley will tell you, sets an earlier deed of gift above a later legacy. The thing was mine before ever he wrote your name. I'm sorry. I am sincerely sorry. There is nothing in it of unkindness to you." There was a silence. The clerk's step could be heard on the stair below, then stopping. Honoria looked at the folded paper a moment, and then she looked up at Crispin Quill's smooth, sorrowful face, and she said, in the same even, unhurried voice in which she had been used to ask the Ashcombe children for their 7 times table, "May I ask the date upon your deed, sir?" He blinked. The date. "It is a flicker, the spring of the year before last. March, I believe. And the witnesses to it? 2 are needful, I think, for a deed. 2, yes, certainly 2. The smile had gone a degree fixed. "Country people. My uncle's parishioners. I'd have their names from the paper if it signified, but I scarce see." And the wax, Honoria went on, gently as though merely curious, "Is your uncle's own seal the same that is upon the will Mr. Alderley holds? For I should think the 2 ought to match, oughtn't they, being the same hand and the same house, and it would set the whole matter beyond doubt at once, if they did." She turned to the solicitor. "Would it not, Mr. Alderley?" Old Alderley had got his trumpet up and had caught, she thought, rather more of this than Crispin Quill would have wished. His dry old face was a study. "It would," he said. "It would signify a very great deal whether the 2 seals matched. And the paper. And the date set against the witnesses living." Yes, he set the trumpet down and looked at the nephew with his pale, fair, cautious eyes. "These are exactly the questions a court of law will put, Mr. Quill, and put hard, before it sets aside a will in favor of a deed. You'll not take it ill in me, who served your uncle 40 years, that I shall require to see your instrument examined as close as ever paper was examined in this kingdom, and the late Reverend's true endowment found into the bargain, before I let 1 child be turned out of that house, or 1 stone of it sold." The 2 questions, the missing endowment and Crispin's prior deed, had come to lie, Honoria saw, upon precisely the same property. Whatever it was that her godfather had hidden, the book that is not where books are kept, this smiling man wanted it too, and wanted it not found, or found only by himself. She said nothing of this. She folded it away with the rest. Crispin Quill recovered himself well. She gave him that. The wounded warmth came flooding back over the brief hardness like a tide over a rock. He put the deed away unhurried, as a man does who fears nothing, and he laughed a soft, forgiving laugh. "Why, examine it to your heart's content. I'd have it so myself, for there shall be no shadow on my name. I only spoke to spare my cousin. Cousin," he turned to her, all tenderness again, "you must not think me your enemy. Quite otherwise. This is no place for you. A frozen ruin, a parcel of pauper brats, a country of bog and bad roads and rude folk who'll give a gentlewoman no society fit for her. Go back to Devon. Let me settle a little annuity on you, a comfortable sum. Say nothing of the law, only my own goodwill to my uncle's pet. And be quit of the whole cold business with money in your reticule and no stain of a wrangle. Come, it is the part of a friend to say it." Honoria rose. She drew on her gloves, finger by finger, and the small mourning ring showed black for a moment against the gray kid before the glove covered it. "You are very generous, sir," she said, "and I will give your kindness the answer it deserves, which is a plain one. There are 31 children at Greystone, with the winter coming on, and my godfather, who held my hand at my father's grave when I was 9 years old, left them and their house into my care. I do not think a gentlewoman wants better society than that, nor a plainer duty. I shall go up to Marsden tomorrow and see to them myself." She inclined her head, quite courteous, quite immovable. "I am glad to have met my cousin. Mr. Alderley, I will wait upon you again before I go, for the particulars of the road and the keys." "You shall have them," said the old man, and there was something in his deaf, dry old voice now that had not been there when she came in, something that sat up, that took a side. "You shall have everything I have to give you, Miss Vale, and my prayers with it." She went down the crooked stair into the blue dusk of the York street, where her trunk waited and a hired gig might be got for the morning, and she did not look back. But had she looked, she would have seen Crispin Quill come to the small window above and watch her go. The smile still set upon his handsome face like something carved there, and that the smile did not reach his eyes at all, which were narrow now, and thinking, and already busy with the cold arithmetic of a man who has just discovered that the unprotected governess he came to frighten off in an afternoon means, instead, to be fought. The wind found her before the house did. Honoria Vale felt it come down off the high moor as the gig topped the last rise above Marsden under Edge, a long, cold, searching wind that smelled of wet bracken and wood smoke and the iron edge of coming snow. She drew her cloak closer with one gloved hand and kept the other on the brass-bound prayer book in her lap, and she looked at the place that was now, by a dead man's word, her own. Greystone stood where the village ended and the moor began, a long, low house of gray stone set with its back to the rising land, as though it had spent 100 winters bracing against that very wind and meant to spend 100 more. One wing of it had lost its roof. She saw the bare rafters black against the bruised sky, and over them a great patched tarpaulin lashed down with rope, lifting and falling at its edges like something breathing. The rest of the roof was sound enough, though the slates were dark and cracked in long veins, and from the one whole chimney rose a thin, brave thread of smoke, straight up a little way, and then snatched sideways by the wind. There was a garden below the house, or there had been. She could see the ruled lines of beds gone hard and white with frost, the blackened stalks of cabbages, a leaning fence. And there were children. They came out to the low wall as the gig drew up, a dozen of them and then more, in clothes that had been mended so many times the mending was the garment now, and they stood and looked at her with the grave, weighing silence of children who have learned that strangers in good cloaks usually mean change, and that change has rarely been kind. She counted them without meaning to. It was a habit of hers. The counting she had a head for figures and could no more let a number go uncounted than let a sum go unbalanced. 19 here at the wall. There would be more within. The driver handed down her small trunk and was glad, she thought, to be paid and gone, clucking his horse back down toward the village and its fires before the light failed. And Honoria stood alone on the frozen track with her trunk at her feet and her prayer book in her hand, and out of the house came a woman. She was broad and square and weather-reddened, with gray hair scraped back hard under a white cap and forearms bare to the cold, and she came down the path drying her hands on her apron with the unhurried, planted tread of a woman who had thrown more than one fine gentleman off these stones and was prepared to throw another. She stopped at the wall, set herself between Honoria and the children, and folded her red arms. "If you're come from the Quill nephew," she said, "you may turn round and go back the way you came. There's nothing here to sell that's his to sell, and you'll not put these children on the road this side of my dying." "I am not come from Mr. Crispin Quill," Honoria said. Her voice was quiet, as it always was, level and clear, and she did not raise it against the wind, but let it carry under. "My name is Honoria Vale. The Reverend Josiah Quill was my godfather. He left Greystone to me, and the children with it, and I have come to see to them." The woman's eyes, small, sharp, set deep in that red face, went over her once, slow, from the plain brown hair to the single dark mourning ring to the worn good gloves and the trunk that was too small to belong to anyone grand. Something in the inventory seemed to trouble her more than fine clothes would have done. His goddaughter, she said. He spoke of one, years back. She did not unfold her arms, down in Devon. A governess. I was a governess, Honoria said. I am that no longer. She looked past the woman to the children, and to one in particular near the gatepost, a small girl who stood a little apart and a little crooked, her weight all on one leg, an iron brace dull beneath the hem of her skirt. The girl looked back at her without fear and without hope, simply looking, and Honoria found that she could not look away first. You'll be Mrs. Tibbet, she said. He wrote your name in his ledger. 40 years you've kept his house. 22 of them, said Mrs. Tibbet. It was others before me. But something had shifted, the arms came down. You know his ledger, then? I have read what part of it the solicitor would let me read, Honoria said. I should like very much to read the rest. But not before I have seen the children warm and the larder counted. She bent, took up the handle of her own trunk before Mrs. Tibbet could move to it, and straightened. May I come in, Mrs. Tibbet? The light is going. And that, more than any speech of grandeur or charity could have done, was what opened the door. For a fine lady would have stood and let her trunk be carried, and a fraud would have made promises, and the Quill nephew had done both. This one took up her own box and asked after the larder. Mrs. Tibbet stood aside, and Honoria walked in under the low stone lintel out of the wind, and the children parted before her and flowed in behind like water, and the heavy door was shut against the moor. Inside it was dim and smelled of wood smoke and porridge and damp stone, and faintly, under all of it, of the cleanness that comes only of much scrubbing with too little soap. The great kitchen was the living heart of the house. It was here the one good chimney drew, and here the children were gathered, and here at the long scrubbed table they took their bread. Honoria stood a moment, letting her eyes find the shapes of the place in the firelight, and she saw, drawn up close to the hearth at the warm end, an empty chair, a plain wooden armchair, worn smooth at the arms, with a faded cushion in it and a footstool before it, and no one in it, and, she marked this, no one near it. The children sat all down the long table and along the bench by the wall, crowded close for warmth, and not one of them so much as set an elbow upon that chair, though it was the warmest seat in the room. That was his, said Mrs. Tibbet, low, at her shoulder. The Reverend's. He'd sit of an evening and they'd come to him with their hurts and their reading. We've not moved it. She paused. The little ones still leave a space when they pass it. Habit-like, then we shall not move it either, said Honoria, until they are ready. And she turned from the chair and took off her cloak and folded it, and rolled back the cuffs of her gray sleeves and asked to be shown the larder. She went through Greystone that evening as a physician goes through a patient, not with alarm but with method, and Mrs. Tibbet went with her holding the candle and watching her with a slow growing wonder. The larder first, she counted the flour to the last scoop, the oatmeal, the salt fish, the small gray hoard of potatoes, the single crock of dripping. She counted the loaves and asked how many the baker sent, and was told, with a tightening of the matron's mouth, that the baker now sent none. Nor would the chandler send candles, nor the grocer tea. For cash they had none, and credit the village had closed to them within the fortnight. She made no exclamation. She took out the small memorandum book she carried and wrote the figures down in her small exact hand, the having and the wanting, ranged in 2 neat columns. And the columns told her plainly that what was in the house would feed 31 children something near a fortnight, and after that there was the frost and the workhouse road. She counted the children too, properly by name, going round the table while they ate their bread, crouching to their level, her gray eyes grave and unhurried. There was the small lame girl, Jenny, 7 years old, who watched her with that level look and said her name out plain and added, unasked, that the brace hurt her at night, in the cold especially, as though testing whether this new one would pretend not to have heard. Then we must see it eased, Honoria said simply, and wrote Jenny, brace, cold, see to it in the book, and the child watched her write it, and something in her small face eased a very little. There was a sharp, dark boy of 11 called Robin, who would not give his name until he had given her a hard stare first and decided something about her, and who then volunteered, in the manner of a quartermaster surrendering a fort he means to take back, that the dormitory in the sound wing leaked over the 3rd and 4th beds, and the boys there slept dry only by shifting to the floor. She wrote that too. There was a baby not 3 months old, asleep in a drawer lined with a folded blanket by the warm end of the hearth. Left at the door one wild night a month gone, Mrs. Tibbet said, wrapped in a shawl with nothing pinned to it but a scrap of paper that said only pity her. They had not even a name for her yet. They called her, for now, the doorstep baby, and the older girls took turns to mind her. Honoria stood over the drawer a moment and looked down at the sleeping child, and her composed face did not change, but she was a long time looking. Then she wrote in her book, larder a fortnight, roof, brace, credit, the book. And she closed it. They sat up late, the 2 women, after the children were bedded, the small ones top to toe in the dormitory under what blankets there were, the bigger ones banking the fire, and over the last of the weak tea Mrs. Tibbet told her what she knew, which was much and yet not enough. He never wanted, she said, turning her cup in her red hands. Not in 40 year. There'd be lean weeks, hard winters, but always at the turn of it money came, regular. And he'd say, I heard him say it 100 times, it's from the old trust, Tibbet, lodged proper and safe. The children's own money settled long before either of us was breached, and no man living can touch it. He set great store by that. There was a gentleman used to come up from Harrogate Hall years back on the trust's business, very grave and civil, and the Reverend would sit with him over the books a whole afternoon and after be cheerful for a week. She frowned into the fire. Then it stopped. 3 year gone, near enough, the money stopped coming, and he never said why, and he went. Different secret. He'd sit at that desk in the study half the night with the door shut. He took to hiding papers, I'd find him at it, and he'd start like a guilty thing and cover them over. And once, only the once, he said to me, low, like it shamed him, Crispin's been at the desk, Tibbet. Crispin's been at the desk again. Crispin, said Honoria, his nephew has been here. Twice since we buried him. The matron's voice went hard, bold as a magpie. In the study both times, going through the drawers, taking papers away in a satchel, and down in the village telling all who'd stand to hear it that Greystone's his by rights, and he'll have the slates off it by spring and sell the shell for a wool store. It's him as turned the tradesman. A word here, a hint there. Don't extend the foundling house. The place'll be sold, and your bill's gone with it. And they believed him, for he's smooth and he wears a good coat and he's a Leeds man of business, and what's a parcel of orphans on the moor against that? She looked up, and her sharp eyes were wet and angry to be so. If there's an old trust, Miss Vale, and I believe there is, for he'd not lie about it dying, then it's the only thing stands between these children and the road, and nobody can find a paper to prove it's there. Honoria was quiet a long moment, and in the quiet she heard the wind go round the house and the tarpaulin lift and fall on the dead wing, and she heard her godfather's words again, that she had copied into her book in a cold Devon schoolroom 100 miles and a lifetime ago. What was set down in 982 is not lost, whatever Crispin may say. Look to the book that is not where books are kept. I should like to see his study, she said. It was a small square room off the kitchen, cold now, the fire long dead in its grate, and it was lined on every wall to the ceiling with books and ledgers and bundles of letters tied in faded tape, the gathered paper of 40 years of a careful man's life. Honoria lit 2 more candles, for she would not search by guttering light, and she began, as she did everything, by method. She would not hunt and snatch as Crispin had done. She would inventory. She began at the desk and went drawer by drawer, and laid out upon the cleared table all that she found, in order, and entered each in her book. She found the ordinary ledgers, the household accounts, and she read in them, plain as a wound, the place 3 years back where a steady yearly entry, a sum received every Lady Day, the same hand, the same source, simply stopped, with no remark, no explanation, only a blank where the money had been. She found his correspondence, the letters of a kind and lonely old man, charity and sermons, and the small business of a parish. She found his sermon books and his accounts of the children, births and deaths and bindings out, 40 years of them, and her throat tightened to read his neat decline into a shaking hand at the end. But she did not find what she sought. There was no deed. There was no trust. There was no special ledger of any endowment, no paper that said 1792, nothing that proved the old money real. The thing her godfather had sworn was lodged safe was nowhere in the room where a man keeps his papers. And there was a letter, sealed and unanswered, that she set apart from the rest and turned over in her fingers a long while. It was addressed to the Reverend Josiah Quill in a strong, sloping gentleman's hand, and the seal upon it was a great one, deeply pressed, a coronet and a device, and across the corner, in another hand, someone, the Reverend himself, she thought, had written and underlined the word unanswered. Mrs. Tibbet, looking over, said only, "That'll be from His Grace, from Harrogate." The trustee, he'd write, the last year, and the Reverend never could bring himself to answer, too ashamed, I think, that the money'd gone astray under his keeping. Honoria set the great sealed letter carefully aside by itself. That, she thought, I shall answer properly, and soon, but not tonight and not in haste, for a thing of weight must be done with a clear head. The candles burned down. The house slept. Mrs. Tibbet, nodding, was sent at last to her bed, and Honoria stayed on alone in the cold study with the wind at the shutter, reading her godfather's line once more by the last good candle. Look to the book that is not where books are kept. A riddle from a dying man who feared his own nephew. Not where books are kept, and yet plainly a book, not in a drawer then, nor in a chest. On a shelf, perhaps, but wrongly, a book that was not where books were kept, even while it stood among them. She rose and took the candle and went slowly along the great wall of shelves, holding the light up, reading the spines one by one with her tired eyes. Sermons, husbandry, the classics, a long shelf of bound accounts. And she became aware, the way one becomes aware of a wrong note in a familiar tune, of the wall itself behind the books. She held the candle close and looked past the shelves to the stone, and saw that this whole wall was newer work than the rest of the room, a partition built across what had once been an open chimney breast, for there was the line of an old hearth bricked up behind the shelving. An older, larger fireplace closed off long ago, and the shelves built over its face. And as she stood close against it with the candle, the small flame leaned. It bowed sideways, steady, toward the wall, and then righted and bowed again. There was a draught coming out of that bricked-up wall, out from behind the books, where no draught should be. She raised the candle higher, to the top shelf, the high one she would need the steps to reach, and ran the light slow along the spines up there, and stopped. One book among them was wrong. It stood like the others, of a size with the bound ledgers lettered like them in faded gilt, but where the others took the candlelight in the soft, deep way of old leather, this one gave it back hard and flat. She brought the steps and went up 2 of them and reached not quite to touch it and held the light to it close. It was not a book at all. It was a block of wood, painted and lettered to wear a book's face, a false spine fitted into the row so cunningly that 100 careless eyes, Crispin's among them, she thought, Crispin rifling the drawers below and never once looking up, had passed it by, and behind it, faint and cold against her reaching fingers, came the draught. She did not open it. She stood a moment on the steps with her heart going quick and steady under her composure, looking at the painted wooden lie that her godfather had set up among his true books to keep his children's living safe past his own death. The book that is not where books are kept. She had found it, and precisely because she had found it, she came down the steps and did not touch it further. A thing of this weight should not be opened alone, by night, by one pair of hands and no witness, for whatever lay behind it would one day have to be sworn to, and a thing sworn to must be opened in the sight of honest eyes by daylight, with another to say, I saw it taken from there and from nowhere else. She had learned exactness from her father over a column of figures, and she would not abandon it now over the most important page of her life. So Honoria Vale marked the place. She took a stub of chalk from the desk and made a small plain cross on the shelf's edge below the false book, where the firelight would not show it, and she wrote in her memorandum, in her small exact hand, high shelf, north wall, 3rd from the chimney end, false spine, draught behind. Open by daylight. Witnesses, Tibbet, and an honest man of the village. Then she closed the book, and gathered the great sealed letter from Harrogate to set by her own bed, and took up her candle, and went up the cold stair past the dormitory where 31 children slept under too few blankets in a half-ruined house on the edge of the winter moor. At the dormitory door she stopped and shielded the flame and looked in at them a moment. The rows of sleeping heads, the doorstep baby breathing in her drawer, Jenny curled small against the cold with her braced legs straight out before her. Robin sprawled watchful even in sleep. The wind worked at the tarpaulin over the dead wing, and somewhere a slate shifted. A fortnight's flour, a closed credit, a roof that let the rain, and behind a painted block of wood on the study wall, a draught out of a bricked-up dark, and a riddle very nearly answered. She was not afraid. She found, standing there, that she was something she had not been in all her careful, penniless, well-mannered life among other people's children. She was needed, wholly and at once, by 31 souls who had no one else, and the strangeness of it settled into her chest and warmed there like a coal. Tomorrow, by daylight, with Mrs. Tibbet and an honest witness at her side, she would open the book that was not a book. Tonight she would sleep, and let the house keep its last secret one night more. Honoria Vale went into the small cold room they had made ready for her, and set the great sealed letter from the Duke of Harrogate upon the table where she would see it first thing, and put out her candle. and the wind went round Greystone in the dark, searching, as it had searched 100 winters, but the walls were sound, whatever the roof, and the foundations she had marked already were good. The slates had not yet cooled, but Honoria did not wait for daylight as she had promised herself she would. She lay an hour in the narrow box bed off the study, listening to the moor wind work at the tarpaulin over the fallen wing, and found that her resolve to be patient had thinned to nothing. The dummy spine on the high shelf, the draught behind it, the cold breath of an old hearth bricked up and built over, these things sat in her mind the way an unbalanced column of figures sits, refusing to let her rest until they were squared. Yet she had said witnesses, and she had meant it. So she rose before the first gray came over the edge of the moor, dressed in the dark, and went down to wait by the kitchen fire until the household stirred, the brass-bound prayer book on her knee and her godfather's note unfolded in her steady hands. When Mrs. Tibbet came down to rake the embers, she found Honoria already there, and stopped in the doorway with her shawl half-pinned. "You've not slept," the matron said. It was not a question. A little, Honoria answered. "Mrs. Tibbet, I must ask you something, and I would have you say plainly if you think me foolish. Last night, by candle, I believe I found where the Reverend kept what he would not keep with the other books. I would not open it alone. I want you by me, and one honest man besides, a man with no interest in this house, who can say afterward what he saw with his own eyes. Is there such a man in Marsden?" The matron's broad red face changed slowly, suspicion giving way to something nearer hope and nearer fear of hope. "Tom Sefton," she said at last. "Stonemason. He set the new lintel over the wash-house 2 summers past, and would take no more than the cost of the stone, for the Reverend's sake. He'll not lie, that one, not to please Quill nor King. I'll send Robin down the lane for him soon, as it's light enough to see the stiles." So it was that by the middle of the morning, with a thin sun struggling over the frost, and the children sent to the far room with Jenny set to mind the baby, 3 people stood in the dead Reverend's study. Honoria, composed, her sleeves turned back. Mrs. Tibbet with her arms folded over her apron, and Tom Sefton, a square, slow man of 50 with stone dust worked permanently into the creases of his hands, turning his hat round and looking at the wall of shelves as though it might bite him. "I want it witnessed," Honoria said, "that before I touched anything, the shelves stood as you see them, and that I have taken nothing from this room. Mr. Sefton, will you look close at this spine, the third from the end, on the high shelf, and tell me what it is?" Tom went up on the library steps, his boots careful on the worn treads, and put his thick fingers to the spine she meant. He pressed it, then knocked it with one knuckle, and the sound was wrong. Not the soft thud of packed paper, but a dry, hollow rap, like wood. "That's no book," he said. "That's a board painted up." Clever mind, whoever did it knew his trade. He hooked a fingernail behind it, and the false spine came away in his hand, light as kindling. The painted leather and gilt letters all a sham over a plain-shaped block of deal. Behind, where the book should have stood, was a black gap, and out of the gap came the draught Honoria had felt, carrying the cold mineral smell of long-shut stone. "There's a catch," she said. "There must be. He was a methodical man. Look for an iron thing, a lever, something a hand could reach without the steps." And it was Mrs. Tibbet, reaching past Tom with a mother's certainty, who found it, a smooth, worn knob of iron set in the shadow at the back of the shelf, no bigger than a thumb. And when she drew it down, the whole lower bank of shelves shifted on a hidden pivot with a groan of disuse, swinging out a hand's breadth and showing the bricked arch of the old hearth behind. And set into the bricks, A thin slab of stone, no larger than a hymn board, fitted so close that none but a mason's eye would have marked it as a door. Tom worked the slab loose with the flat of a chisel, gentle as he would with a child's tooth, and lifted it away. Within was a dry cavity lined with slate, and within that, wrapped against the damp in waxed cloth and then in oiled silk, the things her godfather had hidden against this very day. She lifted them out one by one and laid them on the desk where the morning light fell, and named each thing aloud as she did, so that the two witnesses should hear and remember. A deed, she said, drawing back the silk from a stiff folded parchment heavy with a pendant seal in a tin skippet. An indenture of endowment. She opened it with care, and read the engrossed clerk's hand at its head, and her own breath went quiet in her chest. Made the 11th day of June, in the year of our Lord 1792. It settles a principal sum upon trustees, to maintain a foundling house upon the moor above Marsden in perpetuity, the children to be clothed, fed, taught their letters and a trade, and the trusteeship vested in the family of Marsh of Harrogate and their heirs. Her finger moved down the column of witnessing signatures at the foot, and stopped. Witnessed, among others, by Edmund Marsh, the grandfather, this must be, of the present Duke. The seal is whole. She looked up at them both. This is the thing that was said to be lost. It was never lost. He sat on it like a hen on her egg 40 years and told no one where. And there's more, said Mrs. Tibbet softly, for there was a second book, narrow and tall, bound in worn black calf, its corners gone white with handling. Honoria opened it and turned the leaves, and here was her godfather entire. Here was the exactness she had inherited and never known she shared with him. It was a ledger, but a ledger of one account only, the endowment. Year by year from 1792 it ran, in hand after hand as one steward died and another took it up. The yearly income received from the trustees set down to a farthing in the left column, and against it in the right every shilling of its spending. So much for bread, so much for the wheelwright's lad's indenture, so much for slates after the great gale of 19. So much. One heartbreaking line, for the burying of the infant left at Candlemas, that lived but 9 days, God rest it. For nearly 4 decades the two columns balanced and the work went on. And then, 3 years back, the hand changing to her godfather's own, grown shakier with each page, the income column began to fail. She read those last entries twice before she trusted herself to read them aloud, and when she did, she kept her voice level by main force, the way she kept her voice level over a child's grazed knee. Here, she said, 3 years since. This Lady Day, no payment of the trust income received, the same being redirected, as I am told, on instruction of C. Quill, who holds my note. And the next year the same, and worse. Pressed again by my nephew. He has had me set my hand to papers when my eyes are bad and my head worse, calling them mere securities. I fear I have signed away more than I knew. The Lord forgive me my weakness, but I have hid the true deed where his sort will never think to look, behind the dead fire. For a man who keeps no faith keeps no patience to search. She had to stop there a moment. Mrs. Tibbet had turned her face to the cold window and was pressing the back of her wrist hard against her mouth. Tom Sefton stood very still and looked at the floor, and his big hands had gone quiet at last. The last bundle was letters, a dozen of them, folded and tied with a faded tape, the ink of the latest still scarcely older than autumn. Honoria did not read them all aloud. Some of them were not for any ears but a goddaughter's, and she saw that at once. But she read enough, picking out the lines that made the whole crooked business plain, and as she read, The shape of what Crispin-Quill had done rose up before the three of them entire, like a building seen suddenly through clearing fog. Her godfather had grown frightened of his own nephew. That was the root of it, and the most pitiable. Crispin, his speculations in Leeds going bad, his wool rotting in a Hull warehouse, and his shipping shares not worth the paper, had come north smelling money and found an old man, ill, half-blind, alone but for a house full of orphans. He had been kind first, that was the way of his sort, the letters said as much. He was all gentleness in October, and all teeth by Christmas. He had got the old man's confidence, got the run of the desk, and somewhere in that desk had found, the Reverend now believed, an old deed of gift signed and sealed years before and left blank in its particulars. Perhaps meant once for some honest charity and never used. With a signed and sealed blank in his hand, a man of Crispin's cleverness needed only to supply a body of text in a fair antique hand, fit an antedated page to it, and append the names of witnesses long past contradicting. And he had what looked to any careless eye like a prior deed of gift, conveying Greystone and all endowments thereto to himself, made before ever the Reverend's true will was drawn. He has made the income vanish before my friends could ask after it, Honoria read from the last letter of all. And now he means to make the house itself vanish into a wool store, and the children with it into the workhouse, or the wide world, which is the workhouse without a roof. He counts on my dying first, and the deed being unfound, and my goddaughter being a woman alone, with no man of business and no spirit to fight a Leeds man at law. He has reckoned every soul in this but two. He has not reckoned thee, child, for he does not know thee, and he has not reckoned his grace at Harrogate, who is slow, but who keeps his word as his grandfather kept it. Set the true deed and this book before them both, and the matter is one. Thou hast thy father's exactness and thy mother's mercy. Use the first to save the second. For a long moment, no one in the study spoke. The fire ticked. Out in the far room a child laughed at something, a thin, bright sound, and was hushed. Honoria folded the last letter along its old creases and set it precisely upon the deed and the ledger, squaring the edges with her fingertips as though the neatness of the pile were itself a kind of safety. When she lifted her head, her gray eyes were dry and very clear. "Mr. Sefton," she said, "I will ask you to set the slab back and close the shelf, but to mark first, here on this bit of paper, how the catches worked and where, with your name to it and the day's date, so that you can swear to having seen this hiding place opened and these papers drawn from it. Mrs. Tibbet, your name beneath his. I will copy every word of the ledger and the letters before this day is out, fair copies and true, and the original shall not bide another night where Crispin-Quill knows to come looking." It was as well that she said it, for the danger came that very afternoon, and it came in the shape of the man himself. She had the deed and the ledger wrapped again, and was halfway through her first fair copy, seated at the kitchen table where the light was best, when Robin came pelting in from the lane with his eyes wide. "It's him," the boy panted. "The Leeds gentleman, come up in a hired gig with a fellow in a brown coat, and he's looking at the study window from the yard like he owns it." Honoria did not hurry. She had learned long ago that hurry was the friend of a man like Crispin, and the enemy of a woman like herself. She slid the wrapped originals from the table into the deep covered basket Mrs. Tibbet used for the bread, set a cloth over them, and gave the basket quietly into the matron's hands. "Take this to the far room and sit on it, and do not give it up though he asks you on his knees," she said low. "The fair copy I will keep here in plain sight. Let him see I am only a poor woman copying out old accounts." Then she smoothed her apron, took up her pen again, and was writing when Crispin Quill let himself in at the kitchen door without knocking. He was all warmth, as the letters had promised. The cold afternoon had pinched his handsome oily face, but the smile was undimmed, and he came in rubbing his gloved hands and crying out how glad he was to find his cousin so industrious, so very devoted, in this melancholy hour. "Though it grieves me, cousin," he said, drawing off a glove finger by finger, and casting his eye round the kitchen, the cold hearth, the patched children's coats drying on the rail, "it grieves me to the heart to see a gentlewoman set to such drudgery, in a ruin that can never be made to pay. You wear yourself out for nothing. The place is past saving, and the children, well, the parish has its provision for such, hard though it sounds." "Has it?" said Honoria, and went on writing. Something in her evenness wiped a little of the gloss from him. He came nearer the table and looked down at the page under her hand, and she let him look, for it was only the harmless first column of an ordinary year. But his eye traveled past it to the black calf ledger, which she had been fool enough to leave at her elbow, and she saw the precise instant he knew it for what it was. The warmth in his face did not so much vanish as freeze, the smile staying on the mouth while the eyes behind it went flat and cold as bottle glass. "What book is that?" he said. It was not a question either. "My godfather's accounts," Honoria answered, and laid her hand flat and unhurried upon its cover. "There are a great many of them. He kept everything. He was a most particular man. Give it here. I'll take charge of the family papers. It's only fitting, as heir." He put out his hand for it, and the brown-coated man came a step nearer the door, filling it. She did not give it. She looked up at him with her plain, composed face and said, in the same low, even voice she might have used to a child reaching for the fire, "You are not the heir, Mr. Quill, until a court has said so, and a court has not. Mr. Alderley told you himself that until proof is shown on both sides, no man may sell this house, nor evict these children, nor carry off so much as a teaspoon from it. This is one of those goods. It stays where it is." "You meddling," he began, and caught himself, and made the smile come back by an effort she could almost see. He changed his ground as smoothly as a man stepping from one stone to the next in a beck. "Cousin Honoria, let us not quarrel over a dead man's scribblings. I'll be open with you, since you force me to it. The Reverend, God rest him, died owing me a great deal of money, a note of hand, a heavy one, given for value received in his lifetime, and I am within my rights to call it in tomorrow if I choose. There are tradesmen in Marsden who will thank me to do it, for he died owing them too, and I have only to say the word and the credit of this house is done. Bread, coal, candles, gone, before the week is out, and 30 children to feed on charity and frost. That is the truth of your position, and it is a hard one." He spread his gloved hands, all reason, all regret. "Or, you take a clean £200 from my hand, today, and the gig that brought me carries you back toward Devon a great deal richer than you came, and the parish takes its own, and we part cousins and friends. £200. A governess does not see £200 in 10 years' service. Be sensible." It was, she understood, a very great deal of money, and offered for one reason only. He had seen the ledger and was afraid. The fear in it steadied her wonderfully. "You are generous," she said, "for a man who came here to tell me the place was worthless. £200 is a strange price for a ruin no one would buy." She rose then, gathering the ordinary papers into a neat pile, leaving the black ledger under her hand. "I will not take your money, Mr. Quill, and I will not give you this book, and I will not be hurried out of Yorkshire. You may call in your note if you have one, but understand me plainly, for I am plain by nature. Whatever business is between us shall be settled by law, in the open, before the magistrates, with every paper of yours laid beside every paper of mine for honest men to compare. If your deed is sound, you have nothing to fear from that. If it is not, she let the words rest a moment in the cold kitchen. Then you have everything to fear, and no 200 pounds of mine to buy off the asking. His composure broke just enough to show what lay beneath. You'll regret this, he said very quietly, you and the old fool's brats both. And the ugliness of it, naked for one breath, told her more surely than any deed could that her godfather had read his nephew true. Then the gloss was back, and he was bowing, and saying he would let her sleep on so generous an offer, and that he would see her, no doubt, at the quarter sessions, where these matters were properly tried. And there was a small private triumph in the way he said it that she did not like at all, for it meant he had already set his own machine in motion, and meant to have his forged deed proved and allowed before ever she could gather her strength. He went out into the yard with the brown-coated man at his heel, and she heard the gig wheels grind away down the frozen lane toward Marsden. Honoria stood a moment with her hand still on the ledger, letting the trembling she would not show him pass quietly through her and away. Then she sat down again, drew a fresh sheet toward her, mended her pen, and began to do the only thing she truly knew how to do against a man like that, which was to be exact. She wrote 3 letters that evening, and she wrote them clean, for she had no leisure to write them twice. The first was to Mr. Alderley in York, that the genuine deed of endowment of 1792 was found, and the endowment ledger with it, both witnessed out of their hiding place by Thomas Sefton, Mason, and Margaret Tibbet, matron, that the ledger recorded the income diverted 3 years since on instruction of C. Quill, that Crispin Quill had this day come in person, offered 200 pounds to buy her off, threatened the house with ruin by way of a debt she did not believe in, and plainly meant to rush his own deed to proof at the coming sessions. And would Mr. Alderley come with the law and set his godfather's 2 deeds side by side, for she had begun to mark in Crispin's the very flaws that would damn it. The second letter was to a gentleman in York whose name Alderley's own first letter had given her, an authority on hands and seals and old paper, asking him to hold himself ready to examine a deed she believed antedated, written over a signed blank, sealed with a wax she thought too new, and witnessed by at least one man she meant to prove was already in his grave on the day the deed was dated. The third letter she wrote last and slowest, and copied out twice in her own memorandum before she sealed the fair sheet. Because of all of them it mattered most, and she would have it right. She wrote it to His Grace the Duke of Harrogate, Harrogate Hall, as trustee of the endowment settled in 1792 upon his family's honor. She did not plead and she did not flatter. She set down the facts in their order as plainly as she had set down the children's morning sums, the deed found, the ledger found, the income diverted, the forged claim coming to proof, the 31 children, the winter at the door. She wrote that the trust was his family's to keep, and that she believed him a man who kept what was his to keep, and that she asked him, not as a favor but as a duty long owed, to act now in the trust his grandfather had witnessed with his own hand. She signed it Honoria Vale, and beneath, after a moment's thought, goddaughter and executrix of the Reverend Josiah Quill. In the gray of the next morning, the carrier's cart came up the lane through the first true snow of the year, the flakes coming down thick and slow and silent over the moor, softening the broken roof and the frosted garden, and the long gray face of the house. The children crowded to the windows to watch, breathing little ovals in the cold glass, for the snow was a wonder to the small ones, and the carrier was a rare event to them all. Honoria gave the 3 sealed letters up into the carrier's chapped hand, and watched him tuck them safe in his oilskin against the wet. And she stood in the doorway with Mrs. Tibbet at her shoulder and Robin and small lame Jenny pressed in under her arms, and watched the cart go down and dwindle and vanish into the falling white toward Marsden and the York Road beyond. Somewhere out in that whiteness, the letters were already traveling toward the law, toward the man of hands and seals, toward Harrogate Hall. The genuine deed and the endowment ledger lay safe in the breadbasket under Mrs. Tibbet's bed, with the confessing letters folded inside, and in Honoria's pocket memorandum, copied in her own exact hand, was the beginning of a short cold list under the heading her godfather might have written himself, wherein the deed of C. Quill is false. The page against the rest. The wax. The dead witness. She had not yet proved a line of it, but she had begun, and the snow was falling, and the contest was set. The frost had not lifted from the hollows of the moor when the rider came up the Marsden track, and Honoria saw him first from the dormitory window, where she had gone to set a basin under the worst of the new leaks. She had expected, if she expected anything, a carriage with a crest. Outriders, the whole apparatus of a dukedom come to inspect what its negligence had let fall to ruin. What she saw instead was a single tall figure on a gray horse, plainly dressed in a dark riding coat gone pale at the seams with weather, and one servant a length behind him leading a pack pony. No livery, no flourish. He rode the way a man rides who has ridden all his life and thinks nothing of it, easy and grave, his head bare to the cold. And when he reached the broken gate, he dismounted himself rather than waiting to be helped, and stood a moment looking up at the long gray front of Greystone with its tarpaulined wing, as though he were reading an indictment written against his own name. Honoria set down the basin, smoothed her apron, and went down to meet him. She did not hurry. She had learned long ago that hurry was a kind of fear made visible, and she would not bring fear to this door. Mrs. Tibbet was already in the passage, twisting her hands in her apron. "It's him," she whispered. "It's his Grace himself." Tom Sefton's lad saw the horse and ran ahead. "Oh, miss, what do we do with the Duke?" "There's only the kitchen warm." "Then we will receive him in the kitchen," Honoria said, "and he will be glad of it, for it is cold enough on that road to freeze a man to his saddle. Put the kettle on, Mrs. Tibbet, and send Robin to take the gentleman's horse." She opened the great door herself. The wind came in around her skirts, smelling of frost and heather and the far-off smoke of the village. The Duke of Harrogate turned from his contemplation of the roofless wing and looked at her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. He was a tall man, 39 or thereabouts, with a long grave face, dark hair touched with gray at the temples, and gray eyes that had in them the particular steadiness of a man who has known grief and made his peace with being quiet. He did not smile, but he inclined his head, and when he spoke his voice was low and a little roughened by the cold. "Miss Vale, I think. I had your letter. I am Honoria Vale, your Grace. You have come a long way in hard weather." "It is my weather," he said, "and my road, and by the look of that roof, a good deal too long my neglect." He glanced once more at the tarpaulin straining and cracking in the wind, and something tightened about his mouth. "May I come in? I should like to see the place, and I should like, more than that, to see the deed you wrote me of." I have spent 3 days on the road thinking of little else." She stood aside, and he came in, ducking his head under the low lintel, and the great house took him. And the children, who had gathered at the turn of the stair like a flock of startled sparrows, fell silent and stared at the Duke who had come without a crown. She brought him to the kitchen, where the one sound fire burned and the long scrubbed table waited, and where the Reverend's empty chair still sat in its place by the hearth. The Duke saw the chair, and he saw that no one sat in it, and he did not sit in it either. He took the plain bench across the table when she offered it, and he laid his gloves down with a care that seemed to her almost like reverence. Mrs. Tibbet set tea before him with hands that shook and bobbed and fled. The children were sent back to their lessons. And then, because there was no use in ceremony between two people who had both come to do a duty, Honoria fetched the iron-bound box from the locked press where she kept it, and laid the documents on the table between them in the firelight. He drew the deed toward him slowly. He was a careful reader. She watched his eyes move down the close old hand of 1792, watched him turn the heavy parchment to the light, watched his thumb pause at the trail of seals at the foot of the page, and then he went very still. "This is my grandfather's hand," he said at last quietly, here among the witnesses. "Edmund Marsh, I am named for him. I should know that signature out of 1,000. I have his letter books at home. I read them as a boy." He looked up at her, and there was something raw under the gravity now, something that the cold road had not put there. "It is genuine, Miss Vale. I will swear to it before any bench in England. My family settled this trust. My family was charged to keep it. And my family," he stopped, and his jaw worked, and he finished plainly without excuse, "let it slip. While children went cold under a falling roof, the income of this trust was diverted, and the men who ought to have watched it, my father and then myself, did not watch. I did not even know the half of what was owed here until your letter came. That is no defense. It is only the truth, and you are owed the truth." Honoria had braced herself in the long days of waiting for a great man's pride. She had imagined a duke who would resent being summoned by a governess, who would want the matter hushed, who would weigh his family's name against 31 nameless children and find the children light. She had not imagined this. A man who took the shame onto himself without flinching, who named his own failure as exactly as she might name a figure in a ledger. It disarmed her more than charm could have done. "You could not have known, Your Grace," she said, "what was hidden even from your own sight. The Reverend hid it. He hid the deed and the ledger both, in the wall behind a false row of books, because he feared his nephew and trusted no one living to keep them safe. No one, that is, but the Harrogate Trust and an honest eye. I think he meant you to be found innocent and made useful, not blamed. He thought better of my house than my house deserved," the Duke said. "I mean to deserve it now." He drew the endowment ledger toward him and opened it, and she watched his grave face as he read down the long columns in Josiah's exact hand, year upon year of careful receipt and careful spending, the bread bought, the coals laid in, the slates mended, 4 decades of one old man's faithful arithmetic, until he came to the last pages where the hand grew shaky and the entries grew terrible. "Income this quarter redirected on instruction of C. Quill, who holds my note. I did not understand what I signed. God forgive my failing wits. The children must not suffer for it." The Duke read it twice. Then he closed the ledger gently as one closes the eyes of the dead, and for a long moment he looked into the fire and said nothing at all. "His own name," he said finally. "Crispin's, set down in the diversion, in the old man's own hand, while he yet had wit enough to know he was being robbed and not wit enough to stop it. That is enough to hang a lesser man's reputation. We will need it proved, mind, proved past any lawyer's wriggling. But it is here. It is all here. He looked at her with a new directness. You found this. You opened the wall. You kept the witnesses. You wrote the letters in proper order. You lodged the copies, Mr. Alderley tells me you have already lodged certified copies with him. You have done, in a fortnight, Miss Vale, what my family failed to do in 30 years. I find I do not quite know how to thank a person for shaming me so thoroughly. I did not do it to shame you, she said. I did it for them. She tilted her head toward the passage, where the murmur of the children at their lessons came faintly through. There is a little girl here called Jenny who walks with an iron on her leg, and a boy called Robin who is too clever to waste on a wool store, and a baby that was left at the door 6 weeks past with no name to it but the one Mrs. Tibbet gave. They are why the deed was hidden, and they are why I will not let it be lost. Anything else that comes of it is to the good, but they are the reason. The Duke looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly needful. Yes, he said. I see they are. And then, because he was a practical man and not given to letting feelings stand where action would serve, he set both hands flat upon the table and became abruptly the trustee. Now, we will speak of what must be done, and we will do it today, not at the leisure of the law. The law will affirm the endowment in its own slow time, and we will let it, and we will win. But these children cannot eat an affirmation, and that roof will not wait on a magistrate's calendar. Who has refused you credit in the village? She told him, the corn factor, the coal merchant at Marsden, the very tradesman who had supplied Greystone for 40 years and had been turned, by Crispin's whispering, into men who wanted their money and their distance both. The Duke listened, and nodded, and called his servant in from the cold yard, and gave him 3 messages to carry that afternoon, each in the Duke's own name and over the Duke's own seal, that the accounts of Greystone Orphanage were henceforth guaranteed by the house of Harrogate, that any tradesman who had served the late Reverend faithfully would be paid in full and asked to serve again, and that the corn factor in particular, who had let a foundling house run short of flour in the teeth of winter, might reflect on whether he wished the custom of the hall as well, which he would not have if a single child of Greystone went hungry between this day and the spring. It was done in a quarter of an hour, plainly, without heat, and Honoria understood that she had just watched the whole weight of the village's fear turn over and reverse itself, as a tide turns. By nightfall the coal would come, by morning the flour, and the men who had crossed the road to avoid her in Marsden would be at the door-cap in hand, wanting back the custom they had spurned. It was not justice. Quite justice would come later, in the cold rooms of the Sessions House, but it was warmth, and warmth could not wait. The roof, the Duke went on. Tom Sefton is the mason hereabouts? Then have him up tomorrow at my charge, with men enough, and let him make the worst of it sound before the next snow. Not the whole rebuilding, that we shall do properly in the spring, out of the restored income, as the deed intends, but enough to keep a child dry tonight. And the dormitory. You had a basin under a leak when I rode up. I saw you at the window. There should not be a basin under a leak in a house this trust was endowed to keep. He said it not as a reproach to her, but as a verdict on himself, and she let it stand. That evening the kitchen of Greystone held a thing it had not held in a long while, a kind of peace. The Duke did not ride back to Harrogate Hall in the dark. Though it was only some miles, he sent his servant ahead with word, and stayed, taking a plain supper at the long table with such grace that Mrs. Tibbet forgot, by the end of it, to be terrified of him, and scolded him gently for not taking more of the mutton. The children, who had begun the day in dread of a duke, ended it peering round the door at the tall, quiet man who let small lame Jenny show him her slate, and who looked at her sums with the same grave attention he had given the deed, and told her, truthfully, that her sevens were better formed than his own. Robin, the sharp-eyed boy, sat near him the whole evening, saying nothing, only watching, the way a boy watches a thing he means to grow into. And when the children were ebbed, Honoria and the Duke sat on at the table by the dying fire with the endowment ledger open between them, going over the figures, for there was real work in it, the reckoning of what had been diverted, what must be restored, what the trust might bear for the rebuilding, and she found, somewhat to her surprise, that he was as exact as she was. He did not flatter her arithmetic, he checked it, and twice he was right where she had been hasty, and once she was right where he had been, and he conceded it at once, and without grudging, which she had not often known a man to do. The fire sank. The wind walked round the old house and rattled the tarpaulin. Somewhere above them a child cried out in sleep and was hushed. Neither of them spoke of anything but columns and quarter days and the price of slate, and yet by the time the candle guttered, Honoria was aware, in the careful back room of her mind where she kept such observations filed, that she had not in many years passed an evening she had liked so well, nor sat so easy in any company. She filed the observation. She did not act upon it. There was a great deal still to do. He rode back to the hall before dawn, and within 2 days the machinery she had set in motion began to arrive. Mr. Alderley came up from York in a hired chaise, partially deaf and entirely sharp, cradling his great green bag of papers, and was so moved at the sight of the genuine deed that he had to take off his spectacles and polish them a long while before he could speak. He examined every line of it, and the ledger, and the Reverend's letters, and pronounced himself satisfied to the marrow. He told me to my face the endowment was lodged safe, the old solicitor said, and I half feared the dear man's wits had gone soft at the last. They had not. They were the soundest thing in Yorkshire. He simply did not trust me, or any of us, to keep his secret from Crispin's prying, and by heaven he was right not to. And then came the seals and hand authority from York, a dry, exacting gentleman named Pomfret, who had spent 30 years distinguishing true documents from false for the courts, and who set up his glasses and his reference sheets on the very table where the children took their bread, and went to work upon Crispin's prior deed of gift, which Alderley had compelled into the proceedings. Honoria had already seen, with her own untrained eye, the flaws in that paper. She had marked them quietly the day Crispin first flourished it in the York office. Now she watched a master confirm them one by one, and the satisfaction of it was the cold, clean satisfaction of a sum that comes out right. The deed's first page and its last were not, Pomfret said, of one making. The lower sheet, bearing the Reverend's signature, was older paper, foxed and aged, while the upper sheet that carried the all-important words of gift was newer stock, scarcely 2 years made, though both were dated the same day of 1788. A reused blank, Pomfret said, tapping it. An old signed sheet, kept by, and a fresh page of bequest writ above the signature and annotated. Crude to a trained eye, it would deceive a country magistrate. It will not deceive this bench, not when I have done with it. The wax of the pendant seal, he added, was of a composition not sold by any stationer in the kingdom before the year 5 years after the deed's claimed date. And the second witness, one Abraham Holt, whose name was subscribed in a clumsy imitation. Holt, Pomfret said, would be an interesting man to call, if he could be found. He cannot be found, Honoria said, for I have already looked. There is a Holt in the Marsden Parish Register, a laborer of that name, who was buried in the autumn of 1786, 2 full years before the date Crispin's deed claims he witnessed it. I have the entry copied, and Tom Sefton remembers the man's grandson, who will swear to it. A dead man cannot hold a pen. Pomfret looked at her over his glasses with something approaching respect. Miss Vale, he said, you would have made a formidable attorney had God seen fit to make you a man. I make do, said Honoria, as a woman. The case built itself then, brick on brick, as she liked things to be built, solid, witnessed, certified, each copy lodged in 2 safe hands so that no fire and no thief could undo it. And Crispin Quill, who had begun by treating her as a foolish governess to be flattered out of her senses, learned of every brick as it was laid, for Marsden was a small place and bad news travels fastest of all. He learned that the Duke of Harrogate had come in person and ridden away her ally. He learned that the village had turned, that the coal was delivered, and the credit restored, and his name no longer worth a farthing of fear. He learned that Pomfret of York was sitting at the Greystone table taking his forgery to pieces, and the oily warmth went out of him, and what was underneath came up and showed itself ugly. He came to the orphanage once more, uninvited, on a gray afternoon with snow threatening, and this time there was no cousin and no condolence in him. He found Honoria in the cold study, and he shut the door, and he named a sum. A large one, larger by far than she had ever held or hoped to hold, if she would put the papers back where she had found them, and go quietly home to Devon and let an honest man's deed stand. When she only looked at him, composed, and said that the papers were no longer hers to put anywhere, being copied and lodged in York and at the Hall besides, his face changed again, and he went looking for softer prey. He caught Mrs. Tibbet at the well and told her, with a smile, that the hidden papers were forgeries got up by the governess to cheat the rightful heir, that the matron would be charged as accomplice when the truth came out, that she had best save herself by swearing she had seen Miss Vale plant them. Mrs. Tibbet, broad and weather, reddened and utterly unmoved, told him to his face that she had served the Reverend 40 years and would serve his memory now, and that if he wanted lies he might go to the place lies came from, and she'd thank him to take his boots off her clean step while he did it. And then Crispin Quill made his last mistake before the sessions, the one that Honoria, when she heard of it, knew would undo him in the end. For he could not bear to leave the original ledger where it was, the ledger with his own name written into its damning entries in the dead man's hand, and one night, when he believed the house asleep, he came back to Greystone like a thief and went straight to the study wall, to the opened hearth behind the false books, meaning to take or burn the thing that named him. He did not know, because no one had told him and he was too proud to ask, that the original had gone to Alderley's strong-box in York a week since, and that what lay in the wall now was nothing but Honoria's own fair copy, marked plainly as a copy, left there for exactly such a hand as his to reach for. Robin, the sharp-eyed boy who slept lightest of all the children and had appointed himself, without anyone asking, the watchman of the house, heard the study window and came down barefoot in the dark and saw him at it, saw Crispin Quill on his knees at the broken wall with a dark lantern, drawing out the ledger and folding it into his coat. The boy did not cry out. He was clever, as she had said. He went back up the stairs as quiet as he had come, and woke Tom Sefton's lad, who lodged that night in the stable, and the two of them between them roused the house, so that when Crispin came out into the yard with the stolen copy under his coat, He came out into lantern light and witnesses, and Mrs. Tibbet's voice ringing off the cold stones, and his own ruin written plain across the snow. He bluffed, of course. He always bluffed. He said he had come to recover his own property, that the paper was his by right, that they would all answer for laying hands on a gentleman. And he went off into the dark toward Marsden with the worthless copy in his coat and his composure stitched back over his face. But Honoria stood at the door in her wrapper with a candle, watching the lantern of him go down the track, and she was not afraid, and she was not triumphant either. She was only certain, for she knew now exactly the shape of the thing. He would come to the sessions still confident, with his forged deed and his Leeds tailoring and his story of the senile uncle and the scheming governess. He would not know that they had a dead witness, and a wax that told the year, and 2 sheets of paper that did not match, and a ledger in 2 safe hands that named him, and a theft of a copy he believed an original, witnessed by a barefoot boy and a stable lad, and a matron who feared nothing on earth. He would not know that the trap was already shut, and that all that remained was for him to walk into the room and pull it tight himself. Snow began to fall as she watched his lantern dwindle, the first true snow of the winter, soft and steady, settling on the broken roof that would be sound by morning, on the garden gone to frost, on the long gray house full of sleeping children that was theirs now and would stay theirs. Behind her in the dark passage she heard Robin's bare feet and turned, and the boy stood there grave as a little judge. "Did I do right, miss?" he asked. "I didn't holler. I thought you'd want 'em caught proper, with folk to see, not just shouted off." "You did exactly right," she told him. "You have your wits about you in the night, which is the hardest place to keep them. Go to bed now. There is nothing more wanting tonight that the law cannot finish for us in the morning." And she put out a hand and rested it a moment on his cold shoulder, and he leaned into it the smallest degree before he caught himself, and straightened and went. And Honoria stood alone in the doorway a while longer in the falling snow, composed, with the candle steady in her steady hand, looking down the white track toward Marsden where, in 3 days' time, before the magistrates of the Riding and the Duke of Harrogate steady at her side, the whole of it would at last be laid open in the light. The wind off the moor had not let up all night, but inside the Marsden Sessions room it was close and warm with breath and damp wool, and Honoria Vale sat very still in the second row, with her gloved hands folded over a flat oilcloth packet on her knee. She had chosen the plainest of her 2 dark gowns and a clean collar, and she had slept 4 hours, and she had eaten her bread and drunk her tea before dawn, so that hunger would not make her shake. She did not mean to shake. Across the aisle, Crispin Quill leaned to murmur something to the young clerk he had brought up from Leeds, and laughed once softly at his own joke, and tugged the cuff of his good blue coat so the silver button caught the light. He looked, she thought, like a man who had already won, and was only waiting for the room to be told. Behind the long oak table the 3 magistrates took their seats, Sir Hugh Calder in the middle, broad and red and impatient for his dinner even at 9:30 in the morning, a thin clergyman justice on his right, a square-faced woolmaster named Pickersgill on his left, who had, Mrs. Tibbet had whispered, bought a deal of fleece off Crispin Quill in better years. Honoria had marked that too. She marked everything now, and wrote nothing on her face. The Duke of Harrogate sat at the end of her row, grave in dark gray, his hat on his knee, and when Sir Hugh rapped the table and the murmuring died, it was the Duke the magistrates looked to first, out of habit of rank. But he only inclined his head and said, in his quiet, careful way, that he was present as trustee of the endowment in question, and that he would speak when the facts required it, and not before. Then he sat back, and the room understood that he had handed the morning to the slight brown-haired governess beside him, and a small stir went round the benches. Crispin rose to it gladly. He was on his feet before he was asked, all warmth and sorrow, and he made his case the way a man pours wine for a guest he means to flatter. His poor late uncle, he said, the Reverend Josiah Quill, a saint, gentlemen, but a saint grown old and soft in the head these 3 years past, forgetful, fanciful, easily worked upon. Out of pure family duty he, Crispin, had looked after the old man's affairs near the end, and the old man, in gratitude and in his right senses still at the time, had made over to him by deed of gift the whole of Greystone and all that pertained to it. He laid the deed on the table with a flourish, a folded sheet, a red seal, a date in a clear round hand. And then, gentlemen, this person, he turned and showed Honoria to the room with an open, regretful hand, as one displays an unfortunate object. This governess from Devon, a stranger, seen by his uncle but once in 18 years, had got herself written into a later muddled will, and now came north to turn out an honest man of business and seize a property she had never set foot on till a month ago. He was sorry for her. He had offered her an annuity, generous beyond her station. She had refused it out of greed and the bad advice of a deaf old lawyer. That was the whole of it, and he begged their worships to confirm his deed and let him be about the sad business of selling a ruin that could shelter no one another winter. It was well done. Honoria gave him that privately, the way she would give a clever pupil a hard sum got right. Sir Hugh was nodding. Pickersgill's square face had settled into agreement. Even the thin clergyman looked at her with the mild pity one spares a woman who has overreached. Then Mr. Alderley got to his feet beside her, slow and careful, his ear trumpet of a hand cupped behind his good ear, and asked leave for his client to lay her evidence. And Sir Hugh, who wanted his dinner and a quick end, waved it on as a formality. Honoria stood. She did not raise her voice. She had learned long ago that a quiet voice in a loud room makes the room lean in to hear it, and that a person who leans in is already half persuaded she has something worth the leaning. She thanked their worships. She said she would not ask them to weigh her word against Mr. Torter Quill's, for she knew her word was worth little to them and she did not blame them for it. She would ask them only to weigh papers and dates and the hands of dead men, which could not be flattered and could not be frightened. Then she untied the oilcloth packet on the table and began. She took up first not her own proofs, but the question of what the Reverend had owned to give. She asked the Duke of Harrogate to confirm, as trustee, the nature of the 1792 settlement, and the Duke rose and said plainly that in the year 1792 a principal sum had been settled in trust to maintain a foundling house upon the moor above Marsden, in perpetuity, the trusteeship vested in his own family, and that the house called Greystone was that house. He had himself, he said, this fortnight past examined the original deed of endowment and found among its witnesses the seal and the very hand of his grandfather, the late Duke, which he knew as he knew his own. He had no doubt of it whatsoever. Therefore, and here he looked not at Honoria, but levelly at Crispin Quill, the land and the income of Greystone had never been the Reverend Josiah Quill's private property to give away by any deed, sound, mind, or no. They were trust property. A man cannot make a gift of what he does not own. The room had gone quite quiet. Crispin's clerk had stopped writing. Honoria let that settle a moment, and then she laid the original deed of endowment open on the table before the magistrates, and beside it the endowment ledger in her godfather's exact small hand, and she walked them through it as plainly as she would have walked the Ashcombe children through a column of addition. Here, she said, is every year's income received under the trust since 1792, set down each Lady Day and Michaelmas for near 40 years in one steady hand. And here, she turned to the last leaves, where the writing thinned and wandered. Here, 3 years since, the entries change. She read them out, unhurried, in the plain words her godfather had used. The yearly income redirected, the ledger said, on instruction of C. Quill, who holds my note, and below it, in the same failing hand, I fear I have been led to sign what I did not rightly read. And lower still, near the end, the line that made even Sir Hugh set down his pen, I have hid the true deed and this book against the day they shall be wanted, trusting my goddaughter's honest eye to find them. Their worships will observe, Honoria said quietly, that the name set down by my godfather as the hand that diverted the children's bread is not mine, and is not a stranger's. It is the name of the gentleman who tells you this morning that he only looked after the old man out of duty. Crispin was up at once. Smooth still, but quicker than before. A forgery, he cried. The whole book a forgery, cooked up these past weeks by a clever woman and a senile man's stray papers. Anyone might write Crispin Quill in an old ledger. He appealed to their worship's good sense. Was the word of a governess and a heap of pages to outweigh a sealed deed of gift? No, Honoria agreed, before the magistrates could speak, and the agreement so surprised him that he checked. It ought not to, on my word alone. So let us not take my word. Let us take Mr. Quill's own deed and look at it together, for it is here on the table, and it will tell us more than I can. She had laid, beside the disputed deed, 3 things: a sworn statement from the seals and hands authority she had written to in York, the man himself sitting now behind her ready to be called, the Marsden Parish Burial Register, borrowed of the curate, and a small square of red wax cut from a sample. She took up Crispin's deed and held it to the gray window light so that the magistrates might see what she had seen by candle 3 nights running. First, she said, the paper. Their worships would see that the body of the deed and the sheet bearing the date and signatures were not one paper, but 2, of a different make and a different age, the gift itself written upon a sheet some years older than the leaf joined to it, as though a signed blank long kept had been married to a freshly written page and a date set down to suit. The York gentleman, examined upon his oath, confirmed it in 3 sentences. 2 papers, 2 ages, 1 join. He had seen the trick a dozen times in disputed wills. Second, she said, the date. The deed of gift was dated the 4th of March, 3 years since, and it bore beneath the Reverend's signature the names of 2 witnesses. The first she passed over. The second was one Jonas Greenhow, yeoman, of Marsden. She opened the parish burial register to the page she had marked with a thread, and turned it so the magistrates might read, and she read it aloud for the benefit of the room. Jonas Greenhow of this parish buried the 19th of November, in the year before the date upon this deed. A man cannot set his hand to a paper, she said, 16 months after he is laid in the ground. Their worships may send to the sexton, the stone stands in the churchyard not 300 yards from this room. A sound went round the benches then, not quite a laugh, something rougher and more turning. Pickersgill, the wool master, had leaned forward and was reading the register himself, his agreement gone cold. Crispin had stopped tugging his cuff. Third, she said, and she was sorry to be tedious, but their worships would want the whole, the wax. The seal upon the deed was struck in a wax of a bright vermilion. Lately come into use, she held up the cut square beside it. The Reverend's own letters and his every other paper these 40 years were sealed in the old duller wax, of which she had brought examples. The York gentleman would say, if asked, that the vermilion sort was not sold by any stationer in the writing until within the last 2 years. A deed dated 3 years gone could not be sealed in a wax that did not yet exist. She set the deed down. On its face, she said, even were it genuine, it gives away trust property that was never my godfather's to give, as his grace has shown. And it is not genuine. It is an old signed blank, antedated with a fresh page, witnessed by a dead man, and sealed in a wax not yet made when it claims to have been written. I do not ask their worships to take this from me. I ask them only to look, as I have looked. It was the burial register that had turned the room. She had felt it turn. But it was what came next that she had carried up the moor in the oilcloth packet like something live and warm, and now she took up the last of it. The bundle of her godfather's late letters, tied still in his own black ribbon, and she asked their worships leave to read, not all, but a little, in the dead man's own words. Sir Hugh, who an hour since had wanted his dinner, said gruffly that she might read what was to the point. So she read Josiah Quill into the warm, close room. She read the letter in which he wrote, in his shaking hand, that his nephew had come to him in the bad weeks after his fever, when his head was not his own, with papers and a kind voice, and had guided his pen where he willed, and how, when his wits cleared and he understood a little of what he had signed, he had been afraid of his own blood, which he set down was the bitterest thing a man could write. She read the lines where he told how he had taken the true deed and the endowment ledger and hidden them behind the false books and the old bricked hearth in his study, that no searching hand should find them against the day they should be wanted. And she read, last, the few lines he had meant for her and had never sent, that he had watched her from afar these years, that she had her father's exactness and her mother's mercy, and that he laid the children of Greystone upon her honest eye and upon the Harrogate trust, and asked her pardon for leaving her so heavy a thing, and signed himself her loving godfather, who trusted her. She read it steadily to the end, because she had promised herself she would, and she did not look up until she had folded the letter again along its old creases. When she did look up, the thin clergyman justice had taken off his spectacles and was polishing them with a great deal of unnecessary care, and Mrs. Tibbet, 2 rows back, was weeping openly into her best shawl with no shame in it at all. Crispin made his last throw then, because a drowning man will. He came forward fast, his voice gone hard at last under the warmth, and said the letters were forged like the rest, every word of them invented, the hand counterfeited by this same scheming woman. He would swear his uncle never wrote such things. He would bring witnesses who knew the old man's hand and would say so. Bring them, said Sir Hugh shortly, for the day had got away from the woolmaster too, and Crispin, too quick, too sure, said that John Hardus the saddler had known his uncle 30 years, and would tell their worships the letters were none of the Reverend's writing. There was a small silence. Then a stocky man rose from the third bench, much discomfited, turning his hat in his hands, and said that begging their worship's pardon and Mr. Quill's, he was John Hardus, and he had never said any such thing nor been asked to, and he'd known the Reverend's hand well, and he'd take his oath that what the young lady had been reading was the Reverend's hand and no other, for he'd had letters from him these 30 years, and there was no mistaking it. And he sat down again, red to the ears, and would not look at Crispin Quill. It was over after that, though the law took a little while yet to say so. The York gentleman set his own hand and seal to it that the letters and the ledger were all of one writing, and that the writing matched the ordinary account books of Greystone that no one disputed. Tom Sefton, the stonemason, plain and slow and certain, told how he had broken out the thin stone slab in the old bricked hearth with his own bar while the lady and Mrs. Tibbet stood by, and what had come out of the dark of it, and Mrs. Tibbet, wiping her face, swore to the same and to the empty chair and to the old gentleman's fear in his last months that Crispin had been at the desk. Crispin Quill said less and less, and at the last said nothing, and the silver button on his good blue coat seemed a poor thing now in the grey light. The magistrates put their heads together only briefly. Sir Hugh sat up and rapped the table and gave it out in few words, the way a hungry man gives out anything. The deed of gift produced by Mr. Crispin Quill was set aside as a forgery and would be retained by the court, and Mr. Quill would answer further for it as the law directed. The endowment of 1792 was affirmed, real and intact in principle, its income to be restored and administered henceforth under its proper trustee, His Grace the Duke of Harrogate. And Greystone, the foundling house, with its lands and goods and all that pertained to it, passed clear and secure to Miss Honoria Vale, as the Reverend Josiah Quill's true will had left it, to be held with the endowment for the children, as the dead man had plainly and lawfully meant. Honoria stood through it with her hands folded and her face composed, the way she had stood through everything that morning. She did not cry out, and she did not sway. Only, when Sir Hugh said the children's name and the word secure, she let one tear go, a single tear, for Josiah, for the big warm hand at her father's graveside 18 years gone, and the brass-bound prayer book, and the loving Godfather who had trusted her honest eye across all that distance and all that time, and she did not wipe it away, but let it fall where it would, because she was not ashamed of it either. The room was emptying out into the cold when she came down the worn stone steps of the Sessions House into the clearing winter light, the oilcloth packet tied up again under her arm. The wind had dropped at last. Behind her Mrs. Tibbet was telling 3 of the village women who had believed Crispin a month since and now could not meet her eye, exactly what she thought of them, in the kindest possible terms. Somewhere off down the street Crispin Quill was getting into a hired chaise alone, his Leeds clerk already drifted away from him, and no one watched him go. The Duke of Harrogate came down the steps a pace behind her, and stopped at her side, his hat in his hand, looking out with her at the pale sky breaking open over the grey roofs and the white moor beyond, where Greystone stood with its 31 children waiting to be told. He did not speak at once. He was not, she had learned, a man who spoke before he had the right word. Then he said quietly that she had done a thing that morning he would not soon forget, and that the failing of the trust under his family's name shamed him, and that he meant to set every part of it right, and would be glad, if she would permit it, to begin that very day. And he offered her his arm to the gig. Honoria came down the worn stone stair of Greystone on a grey March morning to find the kitchen warm as new bread, and for a moment she stood on the bottom step and simply let herself be glad of it. The fire that had been a single grudging flame her first night now roared honestly in a mended grate. The cracked slate overhead, where the moor wind used to find its way to the children's beds, was sound and tight, repaired with the endowment's own money under the Duke's quiet order. Robin had laid the long table with the careful pride of a boy who knew himself useful, and small Jenny came across the flags toward her without the dragging limp that had pained Honoria to watch all autumn. The leg iron the Marsden smith had reforged to her measure sat true now, and the child walked. "You'll have your tea by the fire, miss," said Mrs. Tibbet, who had taken to calling her miss the way she had once called the Reverend Sir, as a kind of title earned rather than given. The matron's larder behind her was a thing to gladden the heart. Flitches of bacon hung from the beam, a barrel of good flour, a crock of dripping, apples laid in straw, a wheel of cheese the Harrogate dairy had sent down with the Duke's compliments, and no fuss made of it. There had been a winter, not 2 years gone in Mrs. Tibbet's telling, when the children had gone to their pallets on thin gruel, and the matron had wept in the scullery where none could see. There would be no such winter again. By the hearth stood a chair. It was a plain oak chair, worn smooth at the arms, and through 40 years it had been the Reverend Josiah Quill's place by the fire. And after he died, the children had gone on leaving it empty, as though he might come in from the moor with his coat steaming and his hands cold, and lower himself into it with a sigh. For a long while Honoria had not sat in it. It had seemed to her a presumption, almost a theft. But one evening in deep winter little Jenny had taken her hand and led her to it and said, gravely, that the Reverend would want her to, that he had told them in his way that someone honest would come and mind them, and here she was. So now the chair was Honoria's, and the children left it for her when she was up and about, and reserved it as their own small ceremony of belonging, and she understood at last that it had never been a monument to a dead man, but a place kept warm for whoever loved them next. The orphanage was secure. She let the word turn over in her mind as she drank her tea, the children's voices rising and falling at their porridge, because it was a word she had not been able to think for a long time without a catch of fear behind it. Greystone was hers, willed to her plainly and held now beyond any oily cousin's reach. The 1792 endowment was affirmed and restored, its income flowing again into the proper channel after 3 stolen years. The trusteeship sound in the marsh line as the old deed had set it down in perpetuity. Crispin Quill was gone, ruined. His Leeds speculations collapsed about his ears, his forged deed set aside, and his name a byword from Marsden to York. She did not gloat over it. She had seen too plainly in his confession what fear and greed could make of a man to take any pleasure in his fall, but she did not pretend to mourn him either. He was simply gone, the way a hard frost goes, and the ground he had blighted was green again. The fallen wing was rising. From the kitchen window she could see Tom Sefton and 2 journeymen at their scaffold, dressing stone. The wing that had stood roofless and tarpaulined through the autumn now lifting, course by course, toward a new roof. It was to be a proper schoolroom below and a long airy dormitory above, with windows that opened and a flue that drew, and the children went out at their dinner hour to watch the masons and to be solemnly permitted, one at a time, to set their hand to a stone. Tom worked slowly and well, and would take no more than a fair wage, and when Honoria had thanked him once too warmly he had grown red, and said only that the Reverend had stood godfather to his own boy, and a man remembered. Through these months, with the regularity of a tide, the Duke came. He came on endowment business. There was always endowment business, accounts to be examined, the restored income to be apportioned between the roof and the larder and the schoolmaster they had at last engaged, papers from Mr. Alderley in York to be gone over and signed. Edmund Marsh, Duke of Harrogate, was a careful man, and the trust was his family's honor. And so it was entirely proper that he should ride the some miles from Harrogate Hall with his one servant and sit at the kitchen table over the ledgers of an afternoon. Everyone understood the endowment business. Mrs. Tibbet understood it so well that she had begun, on the days he was expected, to bake a seed cake of which she knew he was fond, and to put fresh rushes down, and to find urgent reasons to be elsewhere in the building once the accounts were squared away. For the truth, which the whole house understood and no one said, was that the endowment had been in order for some weeks now, the income flowing, the books balanced to the farthing under Honoria's exact hand. And still the Duke came. He was not a man made for drawing rooms, and Honoria had grasped that early and been easy with it, where another woman might have been wounded by his silences. He was grave and careful, and his courtesy had a stiffness to it, as of a coat seldom worn. He had been a widower 9 years, and had got out of the habit of company, and the labor of small talk was visibly a labor to him. But by the kitchen fire of Greystone, with a ledger open between them and a child or two underfoot, the stiffness left him by degrees, and Honoria came to know the dry kindness in him, the careful humor that showed itself only to those who watched for it. He watched the children, and she watched him watch them. She had seen him, a grave duke of 39, lower himself onto the cold flags to help Robin coax a reluctant fire of green wood to catch, talking the boy through the trick of it as gravely as he might have spoken to a fellow trustee. She had seen him carry small Jenny on his shoulder to the window to see the snow, the child's hand fisted in his good collar, and not mind it. He brought books. He was forever bringing books. A battered Robinson Crusoe, a primer of natural history with engravings of birds, a slate-blue volume of fairy tales that Mrs. Tibbet read aloud of an evening with the children banked about her like coals. He never made a show of the bringing. He would set the parcel on the dresser and say nothing, and Honoria would find it later. And once in February, when the drifts had cut Marsden off for 3 days and the Duke had been kept at the hall, he sent down by his groom, the moment the road cleared, a small flat parcel wrapped in oiled cloth and addressed in his own careful hand to Miss Vale. She opened it at the kitchen table with the children pressing close, and inside was a prayer book, brass bound, the brass dark and warm with handling, the binding new and supple. It was the twin of the one her godfather had given her at 9 years old, the one she had carried in her lap all the long road north, the one thing she owned that had been chosen for her in love. She had spoken of it to the Duke once, only once, on a winter evening, and he had said nothing at the time, and she had thought he had not marked it. He had marked it. He had searched out its fellow. Such books were not common, and what it had cost him in letters to London booksellers she could only guess, and had it rebound to match, and sent it down with no word at all but her name on the wrapping. She had sat very still over it for a moment, her composure, which had carried her through a forged deed and a magistrate's bench and a dead man's confession read aloud, very nearly undone by a book. Then she had wrapped it again and put it by, and finished the children's lessons, and only that night by candle had she taken it out and held it and understood plainly what it meant, and what she meant to answer when he asked. He asked in March, by the kitchen fire, on an evening when the children were abed, and the new schoolmaster gone to his lodging and Mrs. Tibbet conspicuously occupied at the far end of the house. The accounts were closed. The seed cake was eaten. The fire had burned down to a steady red, and outside the last of the winter's snow was loosening on the moor, dropping in soft falls from the new-laid slates of the rising wing. He had been turning his hat in his hands a good while, she had noticed, for a man who did not fidget. "Miss Vale," he said at last, and stopped, and began again, as a careful man will when the matter is too great for the first words to bear. "Honoria, I am not a man of pretty speeches, as you have had ample cause to learn, and I will not insult you by attempting one now. I have come here these many weeks on the Trust's business, and the Trust's business has been done these 6 weeks and more, and we both know it, and I have gone on coming." He looked at the fire rather than at her. "I find I do not wish to come here as a trustee any longer. I find I do not wish to ride back to the hall of an evening and leave you to the keeping of this house alone, though you keep it better than any soul in England could. You have the only honest eye I know, and the steadiest hand, and I have been a lonely man a long while, and had got it into my head that I should stay so. I should be glad to be wrong." He turned the hat once more. "I would not have you only as my correspondent on trust affairs, Honoria. I would have you as my wife. And I would not ask you to give up Greystone, God forbid it, for the children are yours and you are theirs. And that is as it should be, and you should hold it still, and I would only ask to hold it with you." There it was, plain as a deed, and no flourish to it, which was the only way she could have borne it or believed it. She did not weep, though her eyes stung. She set down the bit of mending in her lap and folded her hands upon it, the single mourning ring catching the firelight, and she looked at him steadily, and she found that her own voice, when it came, was quite even. "I had hoped you would ask," she said, "and I am glad you asked it so." "Yes, Edmund, with all my heart, yes." He looked at her then as though a window had been thrown open in a shut room, and something eased in his grave face that she thought had been clenched there 9 years, and he took her hand across the worn arm of the Reverend's old chair and held it, and neither of them said anything more for a while. And that was the whole of the courtship, and it was enough. They were married in April in the small grey church at Marsden-under-Edge, where Josiah Quill had preached for 40 years, and it was no grand ducal spectacle, for neither of them wished it. The Duke had estates and a great hall and tenants by the hundred, and he might have filled York Minster and brought down half the peerage of the north to see Harrogate wed. Instead, he stood in the little moorland church, with the rooks calling outside and the whole of Greystone in the pews. The children had been scrubbed and brushed to a high shine, and Robin had been entrusted with the ring and did not drop it, and Jenny and the smaller ones strewed the path from the light gate with the first primroses and a quantity of early bluebells gathered off the moor at some risk to their stockings. Mrs. Tibbet wore her best black bombazine, made over and pressed and pinned with a brooch the Duke had given her without a word, and she wept steadily and happily throughout, and made no secret of it. Mr. Alderley came up from York, partially deaf and entirely delighted, and gave the bride away with a courtly bow, leaning to her at the chancel step to say, in the too loud voice of the deaf, that the Reverend would have been a proud man this day, and the whole church heard it and smiled, and Honoria thought it the truest thing said all morning. Tom Sefton stood at the back in a clean smock with his cap in his fist. And the village that had once believed Crispin Quill, that had once been told Greystone would be sold for a wool store and the children scattered to the workhouse, came to the wedding to a soul, reconciled and a little ashamed and glad of the chance to make it right with their presence. So Honoria Vale, the penniless orphan of a Dorset parson, the governess the cool Ashcombs had respected and not loved, became Duchess of Harrogate. But she did not cease to be mistress of Greystone, and that, she would have said, was the marrow of it. The endowment of 1792 was secured as it had always been meant to be. In perpetuity, the principal sound and the income flowing true, the trusteeship joined now to her own keeping, so that no future Crispin could ever again come at it in the dark. The orphanage flourished. Where there had been 31 ragged children huddled under a tarpaulin against the moor wind, there was now a sound house with a sound roof and a new wing besides, a schoolmaster and good bread and fires lit in every grate, and word spread through the riding that the foundling house above Marsden was a thing worth seeing. A model of what one steady, honest hand might do, which was no more than the Reverend Josiah Quill had built it to be, and held in trust through 40 patient years, and reached out of the grave to save. On a soft evening in early summer, with the snow long gone to spring, and the spring softening toward the year's full green, Honoria sat in the Reverend's old chair by the gray stone fire with the children asleep above her, and the house quiet. The Duke sat near, a book open and unread upon his knee, content in the way of a man who has stopped expecting to be content and is daily quietly astonished by it. The new wing stood finished against the last of the light, and Honoria took from her pocket, as she did sometimes, the letter, her godfather's last letter, written in his shaking late hand, the one Mr. Alderley's parcel had carried to a cold Devon schoolroom what seemed a lifetime ago. She read it again by the firelight, though she knew it by heart, that she had her father's exactness and her mother's mercy, that Greystone needed a steady hand and an honest eye, that what was set down in 982 was not lost, whatever Crispin might say, and that she should look to the book that was not where books were kept. She had looked, and found it, and the finding had unmade a forgery, and saved a house full of children, and led her, by a road she could never have foreseen, to this fire and this man, and this chair that was hers now, and would one day be kept warm for whoever loved the children after her. A stranger's letter and a hidden book had not merely made her rich. They had made her the keeper of 31 children's home, and had given her, after all the years of being respected and not belonged to, of being useful and not loved, a family and a place of her own in the world. She folded the letter precisely along its old creases, as was her way, and put it by. Outside, the long northern dusk drew on over the moor, and the lamp burned steady, and all that she had been left was made whole.